Hey everyone, Anarch here, and this is another episode of Liberation in Action, which is a series where I look at both modern and historical examples of horizontal power structures. That is to say, power structures which reject hierarchy and instead choose to organize their societies from the bottom up. And today's example is Fejuve. However, before we get started on this example, I would like to remind you that my Patreon is the reason why I'm able to do this channel. Even though I get some ad revenue, it's the Patreon that actually allows me to continue focusing my efforts on these weekly videos and the much larger video essays that come out every few months. When you join my Patreon, you get access to the Anarch Discord server, where we have a really great community being created. There we discuss things like praxis and history and theory. If those things interest you, you should go over and become a patron at my Patreon, which is patreon.com/anarch. But anyway, let's get started with the video. This example, Fejuve, is actually a federation of neighborhood councils in El Alto, Bolivia. This name is actually an acronym, and it stands for Federation of Neighborhood Councils El Alto. Fejuve is a network of around 600 neighborhood councils, and it has existed since 1979. As of the creation of this video, that makes it 45 years old. And these neighborhood councils provide services to around 114,000 people. That's somewhere around 10% of the total population of El Alto, Bolivia. So here in a little while, I'm going to tell you about the kinds of things that these neighborhood councils do, but first I'd like to talk about a little bit of the history of Fejuve. Fejuve actually came about as a result of policies that were created during the Bolivarian National Revolution. During this revolution, there was a lot of land reform, and one of the things that took place was they redistributed land from a mass of peasants who had been using that land for subsistence farming, and they redistributed it to a series of small commercial farmers who then held that land as private property. At the same time, the Bolivian government also shut down an enormous number of mines around El Alto. Both of these events actually took place in 1952, and so the conditions that created Fejuve actually began much earlier than 1979. However, we will see why that's an important date as we proceed. As a result of this policy of land redistribution and the shutting down of these mines, there was a huge flood of people into El Alto. These two populations of peoples, the people who had previously been peasant farmers and the people who had been working in the mines, were both much more radical populations than you might immediately expect. The Aymara people, who had been the peasants on those farms, actually had a lot of experience with self-organization and forming council structures. They were still connected to these indigenous methods of self-governance. Likewise, the miners had actually been syndicalists, and I should note, they weren't necessarily anarcho-syndicalists. There's no indication that they had anarchist beliefs. Nonetheless, their conception of syndicalism was very much a bottom-up conception. That is to say, they saw these trade unions as being representative of the people and were meant to be organized and directly controlled by council structures. Despite the fact that there was this enormous flood of people into El Alto, the Bolivian government really refused to provide any of the basic services that would be needed to manage a city of that size. This means that they lacked an enormous array of basic social services, and poverty was wildly out of control. These people who had left the countrysides, when they went to the city, found that there were no new opportunities for them there. However, the Aymara people and the syndicalists that had been organizing the mines did not intend to just live in this poverty-stricken city. Instead, what they did was they immediately went to work creating council bodies through which the people of El Alto could make decisions together and provision these basic social services themselves. So between the early 1950s and 1979, there was the creation of an enormous number of these sort of neighborhood council structures. These council structures immediately went to work providing things like sanitation, electricity, they began paving the streets, they provided telephone services, but we'll get to that here in a minute. Also, at the same time, the syndicalists had begun creating a series of trade unions, which had begun taking over a significant portion of the local economy and providing union representation to the workers there in the city. As I said, this took place from the early 1950s to about 1979, and in 1979 is where the turning point takes place, and they create what is called Fejuve. Fejuve is a federation which brings together all of these neighborhood council bodies and trade unions. It coordinates them together in a horizontal fashion where all of them make decisions for themselves and then those decisions bear on the entire federation. So this brings us to the organization of Fejuve. Fejuve is a federation of directly democratic bodies. That is to say, all decisions within all of these bodies are made by the people who are affected by those decisions. That is to say, the people in the neighborhood are the people in the neighborhood councils. The people that are in the workplaces are the people who are in those trade union councils. So how do they manage that? The answer, as is starting to become a trend, one might notice in all of the videos in this series, is that they have what are called popular assemblies. These popular assemblies are meant to bring together all of the people who are affected by the decisions of those different civil council bodies. And when they come together, they make decisions together through what is called consensus. That is to say, they have to have unanimous agreement inside of these council structures in order to make a decision. According to the people in Fejuve, however, each of these councils really ends up having about 200 active participants at any given time. However, this is a pretty large-scale assembly. I mean, imagine getting 200 people in a room and then using a consensus process to make decisions. It should also be said that even though Fejuve is largely male, it has a much higher percentage of representation from women than any other surrounding governance structure in the area. That is to say, they have about 30% participation from women in the area. Fejuve has also established a long precedent that participation within the councils is required by the people that are in those areas. That is to say, there was a period of time where they actually said that it was mandatory to attend these council meetings. However, it doesn't seem as if there's actually any form of enforcement of that mandate. It seems instead that this has become a sort of social principle. So there is extremely high attendance within these council structures. The numbers that were given just a moment ago of about 200 people per council, it seems to me that those are probably the delegates that they elect within the councils. Delegates are very different from representatives. They are not allowed to carry out anything that is not within the mandate of the councils. That is to say that all they really are is middlemen for the implementation of the decisions of the councils. They are temporary and they are instantly revocable. That is to say, any decision that is made by the delegate that is not within the desires or not within the scope of the mandate of the councils can and very likely will lead to the revocation of that delegate from the position that they were given. According to Fejuve, these delegates hold meetings quite a bit more often than the general assemblies because they're carrying out ongoing tasks that are within the mandates of those general assemblies. It should also be said that they have limitations on who can be elected as a delegate. Nobody can be elected delegate who is the leader of a political party, a merchant, a real estate speculator, or anybody who has ever collaborated with the Bolivarian dictatorship. One might ask, how can they provide all of these services? Well, the answer is that Fejuve works by pooling together the resources and expertise of the people of El Alto. And then within the councils, they determine how they are going to distribute these resources and implement the expertise of the people that are there. This allows the people within those areas to fully determine how each of these services are going to be carried out, how they are rendered, and at any given time for them to change the mandate of anybody that is in a delegated position or anybody who has any form of expertise as they please. What this does is it maintains power at the bottom of this structure. So earlier I kind of read off a few of these services, but I want to list out some of the services that I found were provided by these Fejuve neighborhood councils as I did my research. Fejuve offers a public university. They pave the streets in El Alto. They manage all of the public schools in El Alto. They do all of the trash pickup. They're the ones who manage all of the telephone service infrastructure. They are the ones who manage and implement all of the utility services within El Alto. They are the ones who build and maintain all of the public parks. And they also act as a sort of form of directly democratic but decentralized planning. That is to say, they determine how assets will be redistributed and how experts will be delegated into positions of administration. That's all carried out by the neighborhood councils of Fejuve. So when you're hearing about this, this all sounds very like civil, right? However, Fejuve has been very active in rebellion over the course of its history. Numerous times, the neighborhood councils themselves have come together and have organized revolts through protests and direct action, and some of this has even escalated to retaliatory violence against the people within El Alto. For example, in 2003, Fejuve was incredibly central to the Bolivian gas conflict, as it's sometimes called. Fejuve came together and coordinated mass protests and direct action, which were aimed at stopping the policies that were being passed by the Bolivian government around gas, and instead pushing the Bolivian government to nationalize the gas resources of Bolivia. So in El Alto, they actually had about 60 people die, and they were directly massacred on the order of President Gonzalo Sanchez de Lozada. However, Fejuve was successful. They were able to pressure the government to do precisely what they wanted. It's also often said that this was influential in the election of President Evo Morales, who is still president of Bolivia to this day. In 2005, Fejuve was also very influential in ousting the creation of private water companies in the area. Through direct action and protest, Fejuve was successful in refusing the entry of private entities and disallowed these private entities from taking control of the water services there in El Alto. Over their history, Fejuve has been very critical of government involvement. I mean, for obvious reasons. They came about because the government failed to provide the necessary services for the people of El Alto. They had to do the work of organizing all of these social services and basic needs within El Alto themselves. Fejuve, for the majority of its existence, has been very much in conflict with the Bolivian government. However, recently, things seem to be changing on that front. With the election of the Morales government, Fejuve has been collaborating with the government quite a bit more. In fact, this has led to some pretty substantial internal conflict within Fejuve. As soon as the Morales government came into power, numerous people within Fejuve actually ran for positions within the government and succeeded in being elected into those positions. Several of these people were called out by people within Fejuve as threatening the movement by getting involved with the government and therefore threatening the autonomy of Fejuve. In truth, their collaboration with the government has been both a success and a failure. However, first, it was largely a failure. Let's talk a little bit about that. So the first major event to note was that the government proposed there would be the creation of a water company in El Alto. And Fejuve was in agreement with the creation of the water company. However, they suggested that if it was going to be created, it needed to be managed by participatory democracy by the people of El Alto. This is the first failure of collaboration that I was mentioning. The Bolivian state just rejected any participatory or democratic aspect of this water company being established. This was part of a larger process where the government was wanting to begin providing some of these services to the city of El Alto. And in that process, Fejuve then suggested that all of these services that were being offered, or that the government was proposing would be offered, would all be managed and determined by these civil council structures that Fejuve had created. However, this was also rejected by the government. At this stage, a lot of people were starting to feel that Fejuve had been defanged, that their process of collaboration had actually really undermined the movement. At this stage, Fejuve's attempt to collaborate with the Bolivian government had almost unanimously been a failure. And in fact, it had been such a failure, they were having difficulty even mobilizing the base that they had created. However, in 2008, more unrest came to Bolivia. And as this unrest came to Bolivia, there was the creation of an enormous number of new radical council structures there in El Alto, which were directly inspired by what Fejuve had created. This invigorated Fejuve, and it brought them back to their roots to some degree, such that Fejuve once again actually became a power for revolt in Bolivia. So Fejuve was very active in these revolts starting in about 2008 and has continued to be pretty active in the years since. However, Fejuve maintains what they call a critical but constructive relationship with the Morales government. This is probably because Morales expresses open support for Fejuve. In fact, Morales even marches with Fejuve in protests sometimes. So it's easy to see why Fejuve sees Morales as being a possible ally. Also, this collaboration effort has actually started to show some successful outcomes. New services have been offered to El Alto, and Fejuve has successfully convinced the Bolivian government to include participatory democracy in the planning process or the distribution of these social services. They have also ensured that a public housing program that the state is carrying out there in El Alto is actually planned and structured by way of the same participatory council structures. Lastly, they've convinced the state to support a series of social enterprises that Fejuve has established in the area, and in doing so, that has allowed them to expand worker control within the city. With all this in mind, I want to end with some concerns and criticisms. Even though Fejuve has been very successful in collaborating with the Morales government, this is a very thin line to tread, and we have a lot of historical evidence to suggest that this is what it looks like when a movement is slowly co-opted by a reigning party in government. Hierarchical powers have a tendency to swoop in, associate themselves with popular movements, and then co-opt those movements by placing themselves at the helm. In fact, what is happening between Fejuve and the Morales government reminds me a lot of what the Zapatistas attempted to do with the Mexican government. And the result is that the Zapatistas swore off collaboration with the Mexican government because it went so badly at the end of the day. Obviously, the Mexican government was less cooperative than the Morales government. However, the dynamics at hand are ultimately going to be the same. The government is going to want to create control over these neighborhood council structures and trade unions. This is also why the previous example in this series, Quequesasola, has sworn off any grants or infusions of capital from the Venezuelan government, precisely because they are afraid of the Venezuelan government possibly co-opting their movement. That is to say, they're trying to create and maintain autonomy. However, I just want to say that it remains to be seen what Fejuve's future is. We don't know necessarily what will happen with this collaborationist project. There's just some things to be concerned about as we move forward. I should also say that What Fejuve is doing is extremely close to what Bookchin advocates is done with libertarian municipalism. That is to say, Fejuve has created a federation of neighborhood council bodies, bodies which are located within particular localities and which bring the people together as citizens of an area and have them make directly democratic decisions about how all of their resources will be distributed. And then there is a limited collaboration with local government at the level that they are at, using the resources of the government in order to empower these council structures and allowing them to reconfigure the municipality that they are within. In fact, I think this may be the only example of libertarian municipalism actually working in the real world that I have ever read about. So I'm going to be keeping an eye on them because regardless of the fact that there is a real risk that they might be co-opted by the current government, that is not a guarantee. And what we've seen historically is that bottom-up movements that maintain control and they do not give away their power to some hierarchical entity, which they have not yet done, these are able to withstand all kinds of different crises. So I will be very interested to see if Fejuve is able to survive this project of collaboration with the government. After all, Fejuve has existed since the 80s and has roots going all the way back to the 50s, where it was established as these bodies of revolt, of direct action, where people solved these problems on their own. And they created these bodies precisely so that they could maintain control over the world around them. Fejuve is a perfect example of how if power structures are not going to provide for us, we can provide for ourselves. We just have to do the work of organizing people together so that they can redistribute the resources that are available to them, so that they can delegate expertise, so that they can plan holistically about what they want to see happen within their localities, and then carry it out. And that is what Fejuve is doing and has been doing, in fact, since the 50s. So I find Fejuve to be a very inspiring example despite the real risks that they currently face. Fejuve is a perfect example of the principles of direct action and prefiguration. But that's about it for this video, I think. I hope you found that interesting, and as usual, I have provided links to the resources where I learned about these details from in the description below. Lastly, I just want to say that if you appreciate the work that I'm doing here on this channel, you should go over to my Patreon and become a patron for any amount. $2, $5, $7, $10, $20, whatever you can spare would be enormously helpful. Also, you'll get access to the Anarch Discord server, where we really have a great community being created, where we discuss praxis and history and theory and all kinds of examples in the real world where these principles have been carried out. Also, we're just developing a really good community. There's a lot of good people there that have all kinds of great conversations. So I think you're going to really enjoy it, and you should go over to the Patreon and just pledge any amount. Even the lowest tier gets you access to the Discord server. But I think that is about it. I hope you enjoyed the video, and I'll see y'all next time.